In the morning, citizens, broadcasting live from the heart of Qumulo Hill Country, where we are always very demure and very mindful. I'm Will Stroh, and joining me today are fellow Cumulons and all-around stand-up guys from the Qumulo Customer Success Department. We have Senior Customer Success Engineer Phil, whose last name I shall not pronounce, and Solutions Architect Joe, whose last name I shall not pronounce. And today we'll be covering multi-tenancy, so stay tuned if you don't know what that is. And if you do know what it is, stay tuned anyhow. We'll show you some cool stuff and laugh at Phil. Now, we're also going to give a special birthday call out to JP in Toronto. Hope you have a good one, brother, and be sure to check out that dog fountain down by the St. Lawrence Market. And if you do have a special shout-out, birthday wish, or hidden agenda, feel free to drop us a line at care@qumulo.com, and we'll see about fitting it in. And with that, Phil, take it away. I'm going to go pay some bills.
All right. Thank you, Will. Thank you for that introduction. So my name is Phil Pereira, Senior Customer Success Engineer here at Qumulo, part of the Customer Success team. So today we're going to talk about multi-tenancy. If I can get myself situated, there we go. So what the Q is multi-tenancy? So at a very high level, it's network layer cluster partitioning. With network multi-tenancy, it allows a storage admin to logically partition access to a cluster across different networks by placing them into tenants. And if we take that high level and we break it down a little bit, so there's three parts. There's the network layer cluster partitioning, where you can take a network and partition into tenants. And this can be done via QQ REST API calls as well as QQ CLI. And the command for that is QQ multi-tenancy _create _tenant. Networks can be assigned to tenants once a tenant exists, or if you're creating a network and you already have a tenant that exists, you can also assign that newly created network to a tenant. So to assign a network to an existing tenant, it would be QQ network _mod _network. You provide your network ID, and then you provide the tenant ID that you want it to be a part of. So the other layer, so our network layer, the most important part here. So Qumulo, as you all know, can have one or more networks or VLANs that are configured on it. By default, these networks or VLANs have IP addresses that provide access to the cluster for all your various services as a whole, like your SSH, your SMB, NFS, Web UI, as well as REST and replication. So that's at the network layer. With network multi-tenancy, we now have what's called the tenant layer. So with the tenant layer, we can take our networks and partition them into tenants. And a tenant is a separate entry point into the Qumulo cluster from one or multiple networks or VLANs on the cluster. Each tenant provides an individually defined access to the cluster for its various services, such as your SSH, SMB, NFS for each network that's assigned to that tenant. So basically, if you have two tenants, you can determine which service you want to be available on that tenant. So one tenant with SSH, one tenant without, one tenant with NFS, one tenant without, or enable them for all tenants if you so choose. Okay, moving right along. So with network multi-tenancy, the tenant access control is a part of it, and with that, it allows a storage admin to enable or disable those different services in the tenants. And we typically categorize them into two types of access controls. You have your management type access controls and protocols, as well as your file system access controls and protocols. And if we break down into those, so our management access controls and protocols, typically we define these as your SSH access, your Web UI access, your REST and QQ API access, as well as replication. For file system access and protocols, these are defined as your SMB and NFS, and then within each tenant, you can define whether or not you want NFS v4 to be enabled on that tenant. So you have NFS v3 as a whole, and then you can enable or disable NFS v4 per that tenant as well. And then, so network multi-tenancy availability in Qumulo Core 5.3.4, a new submenu option called Network Multi-Tenancy became available in the Web UI under the cluster drop-down menu. It was disabled by default. So if you did access it, it would tell you that it was disabled and you'd have to enable it in the web UI. But once it was enabled, there would be a brief 1 to 2 second pause in your web UI screen where the cluster would be partitioned into one default network tenant to start. And then beginning with Qumulo Core 6.1.0 and higher, network multi-tenancy became enabled by default. So at this point, it's always on and always available if you were to upgrade your cluster to 6.1.0 plus, if you're on an earlier version, or build a net new cluster on 6.1.0 plus, all your networks would fall into a default tenant to start. There's no behavioral difference to pre 6.1.0 versions of Qumulo Core without multi-tenancy enabled or a multi-tenancy present. And everything, as I stated, lives in a default tenant to start. So some things to consider with network multi-tenancy. You always want to plan twice and partition once. So partitioning happens only at the network layer. The entire cluster file system remains a single file system underneath. So the concept of having folders that live and are tied to a tenant doesn't exist, as the file system is still one single file system, and we're partitioning just at the network layer, defining access to the various resources. SMB shares and NFS exports have their own access restrictions. So if you're familiar with the SMB share permissions in the web UI and the host restrictions that you can set, those are also individually set per tenant once multi-tenancy is enabled and you have more than one tenant. Same goes for NFS with host restrictions and user mappings. Those are all also per tenant once you have multiple tenants available. For accessing your cluster, one of its net new tenants or any multiple tenants, if you're going to be using CNAMEs in DNS or new static A records to reference the new set of IPs, you must create your valid SPN records for Kerberos authentication to function properly. So for those who are familiar, SPNs, as you're aware, are created on the Qumulo cluster machine account object in Active Directory. And this just ensures that Kerberos works correctly, and when you're trying to connect to that name, the cluster is able to respond correctly via Kerberos. Another consideration here is that our S3 and FTP protocols are not tenant aware. So this means that S3 and FTP protocols are available on all tenants. They're always enabled and available on all tenants. Another consideration with network multi-tenancy is that it works seamlessly on layer 2 networks. If layer 3 is required for client access, reach out to us on the customer success team. We'd be more than happy to guide you through some best practices on routing. Okay, here's a simple example with limiting SSH to a management, quote unquote, network and tenant. So in this scenario, I have a cluster that has 2 networks and 2 tenants. My network 1 has an IP of 192.168.10.11 and a tenant that I've called management with the SSH service enabled. On my network 2, my cluster has an IP address of 192.168.20.11, and it's in a tenant called clients with SSH service disabled. So if my client connects to each tenant IP via PuTTY for SSH access, if I connect to my management tenant IP, I'm able to successfully connect and receive my login prompt. However, if I connect to my client's tenant IP in the 192.168.20.11 IP address, the connection times out as the service for SSH in that tenant is not enabled in my multi-tenancy configuration. Likewise, if I'm looking at SMB shares, same scenario, same cluster, 2 different networks, same IPs, but slightly different tenant names. So I have, let's say in this case, net new cluster, everything's in my default tenant. I haven't modified that tenant in any way. I then add a second network with the 192.168.20.11 IP, and I place it into my new tenant called financial, and I enable SMB only on that tenant. And I create a share called financial_only_share. And then my client connects to both IP addresses, or if I had CNAMEs or static A records referencing my cluster on both IPs, they would connect to that. If I connect to my default tenant IP address, I'm presented with my data underscore share that existed. And I can't see my financial underscore only share. But if I connect to the IP address that's been assigned to my financial tenant with my client, I can then see my financial underscore only underscore share in my SMB stack, but I cannot see the data underscore share that belongs to my default tenant.
And so, Phil, just to drive a point home there,
yep.
If I am connecting to the financial side, is there any way, shape, or form I can talk to that data share?
Very interesting question. The answer is yes, and I will show how that's possible in the demo. But by default, no. And the answer is only yes if I were to take my data underscore share pointer that's on my default tenant and point it to the same file system path as my financial only share points to on the other tenant. Because again, the file system is still just a single file system that's flat underneath, and we're partitioning at the network layer. And that'll make a little bit more sense once I go through the demo and kind of run through it with the flexible options that are available. And that leads us into the demo. So hopefully everyone can see my screen okay, and the text is not too small. Here I have a VM that's running, and I'm connected to my Qumulo cluster. In my Qumulo cluster here, if I look at my network configuration currently, I only have one IP address assigned, one network. If I look at multi-tenancy, I only have my default tenant on my native VLAN, and I've got all my services enabled. I have a look at my NFS exports. So the only thing I've done here is I've created an NFS export that's called data underscore export, and it goes to my file system path of /data. And because in this case, I want SMB users to access the same data, I have a share called data that goes to my /data file system path as well. So let's say I wanted to enable multi-tenancy here. If I connect to my cluster over SSH, so I've logged in as admin, elevated to the root prompt. Now I'm just going to jump into our Qumulo container shell, and on here, I'm just going to list our tenants. So just like the web UI showed us, we have one tenant. It's called defaults. My network ID of 1 is in there, and I have all my services available. If I look at my currently configured networks, again, just like the web UI, we have our one single network. Its ID is 1, and it currently lives in tenant ID 1. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new tenant that's going to be called finance tenant, and I'm going to enable NFS and SMB only. So if we run through that, so we ran QQ multi-tenancy underscore create underscore tenant, provided a name, enabled SMB and NFS. Our return output is that we now have tenant ID 2. We have just SMB and NFS enabled. If I rerun our list tenants, we can now see that there's 2 tenants present. My second tenant doesn't have any networks assigned to it yet, as I only have my one network currently, and it lives in default. And over on our web UI, we can see now that the tenant column has appeared because I now have a second tenant, the cluster saying, all right, so now my existing shares or any net new shares or NFS exports can have a tenant defined. I look at my network multi-tenancy, I pretty much see the same thing as the CLI that's exposed. Okay, so now with that, what I'm going to do oh, that's my bad. Okay, so We're going to add a new network to this cluster. The network is going to be called finance. There's my subnet mask, my IP range, specify my DNS server search domains, my MTU, and then more importantly, my VLAN ID. And I'm going to add this tenant add this network right into my tenant ID 2, which is my new tenant. So now if we have a look at our multi-tenancy list, so now we can see that we've got our second tenant that's present now, or still present, and now we have an actual network that's been defined to that tenant, and that's our network ID 2. If we rerun our list networks, we can see the same. So now we have a second network that's been added with network ID 2. There's my VLAN ID, my IP address that's been assigned, and I live in my tenant ID 2. And just for completeness sake, on our web UI, we can now see that if I reload our page, our finance tenant is present. It's in we have a network called finance on VLAN 221 that's been assigned to that tenant. And we have just our NFS and SMB protocols enabled, no management protocols. So if I head over here and just quickly do a little check. Oops. My original IP is reachable. We try to hit our second tenant. He is reachable as well. Now, if I head over to my SMB shares, so we'll run through a couple different use cases. First one will be I want complete separation. So what I'll do is I'm going to create a new share. Now, because I have two tenants, I have the ability to define which tenant I want this share to be presented. So I'm going to select I want this share in my finance tenant, which basically means if I connect to the IP address that belongs to the default tenant, the share will not be visible. File system path is going to be, we'll just call it finance for the sake of my typing and you're watching. And my share name is going to be called finance. Just going to give everyone read write so that we don't deal with any permissions, funkiness, and get that share created. And I'm going to do the same on the NFS export side, just to get that out of the way. Avoid jumping around too much. So on here, you know what? I also want to present this same file system path over NFS. I don't need to create it because it already exists. And I'm going to call this finance underscore export. There we go. Let's get that created. Perfect. Now, if I want to be complete, I need to get my SPNs created and my DNS records. So I'm going to hop over to my AD server. Here's my DNS. I'm going to create new a record for this guy, and he's going to be called column finance tenants. It's different. So 221.150.118. Okay, so now we have our host A record. And if I head over to my AD, and then go to my cluster's machine account, attribute editor, down to our service principal name. And we can see I've got a couple service principals that are present, but not the one that I just created for my A record. So if I were to try to connect, we're going to possibly face a bunch of issues with Kerberos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my SPN records so that Kerberos is happy. Now, on here, there's no easy way to copy and paste, but there is a little trick for those who aren't aware. If you were to select an existing entry and hit remove, it moves it up here. So then you can copy it, re-add it, so we don't actually remove it, So now I can paste and modify as needed so that I know that I'm not really messing up my syntax. Okay, and then I'll do the same for the fully qualified name. Move that temporarily. Add that, and then I'll paste it and modify it. Okay, so now I have my SPNs created for my new A record. Good, and then I'll just validate for my client. So I ping my original cluster name, cs-fill-2-4. Get my default tenant IP. If I ping a new A record, I now get my new tenant IP. So with all that set, shares created, SPNs are there. I'm going to open up File Explorer. Let's navigate over to that guy. So as we can see here, if I open up my shares in the background, so it all lines up, the only thing that is visible on my default tenant is my data share and my file share, because as you can see from back here, those are the only ones that are actually present on my default tenant. Access my data share, I can see I've got a folder and a file inside. Now, if I take this and access my new name, I can see my finance share, because that one is part of my finance tenant, and this name maps to my finance tenant IP address on my cluster. And if I access this, there's nothing inside as it's blank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder in here for the demo's sake. And that is the basic network multi-tenancy partitioning for an SMB share. If I look over at my Linux client, which I also have, and I do the same thing, but in this case, you know what I'm going to do.
Hey, Phil, we got a question here. Can you have shares with the same name across different tenants?
Yeah. You know what? We can demo that and then touch on NFS after. So that's part of the flexibility. And going back to Will's question with network multi-tenancy, you totally have the flexibility of playing around with it. So on that, let's look at my finance share that I created in my finance tenant. Let's say I want people who are in my finance department to access a separate share, but they've got some legacy workflows, user mappings that I don't want to go to every client and change, or I don't want to change login scripts. I can totally, that's my file system path. I can totally take my share and give it the exact same name, because the share name and the share itself is just a pointer to a place in the file system. So now I have a share of the exact same name, but they're pointing to two different locations in two different tenants. And if I head back to my client and I refresh, you can see that my share name is now called data. And if I access it, I can see my finance data. However, if I repeat that and pretend I'm a different user in a different department and I'm accessing my default tenant, I also see my data share as well as files, but because I'm coming on a different network tenant, I see the data that belongs to my default tenant within my data share, not the stuff that's in the finance. Also, you do have the complete flexibility of making them exactly the same. So let's say I wanted to take the share and also point it to the data directory on the file system. have the same name as data, but depending on what IP you're connecting to determines which tenant you're coming across. I can do that as well. So if I'm on my normal client and I refresh, I'm still here. If I head over to my finance tenant, so I haven't refreshed yet, and before I was looking at my finance folder, but if I refresh, did I not save that? You know, if it can fail, it will fail in a live demo. This is what's expected to see. So we'll maybe fighting with Kerberos. Guaranteed if I log off, log back in, Windows cache will blow away and it'll do exactly as I need. So just to differentiate the IPs. So two different tenant IPs, same share name, both pointing to the exact same file location on or file system folder in the file system, but coming across on completely different tenants. So multi-tenancy is completely flexible. You can mess around and flip it that way. I've seen some customers do something just like this, but this was like a replication tenant, and they wanted the replication server to come across on a completely separate VLAN so that they had further security controls where if they needed to, they could always just disable that VLAN on the switch and the backup server would be cut off from the cluster. So here, if I jump back over to the NFS portion, so one thing that I wanted to demo here is, let's say I had the Qumulo presented across to different sites regionally. So in this case, I have a record that says East 1 points to my default tenant and West 1 points to my finance tenant. If I run a show mount, qualified name. So here I can see that if I connecting to my East 1 A record that points to my default tenant, I can see my exports that are presented, which are data export. And if I match that with the web UI in the background here, I repeat that and look at West, which points to my finance tenant. Going there, West -1. Fighting with caching again. Oops, 221.
Do you have the export already created?
Yeah, my export is here. It might be my client. Never have a perfect demo.
Huh.
Let's try mounting it. Okay, so on this client, tenant 1, let me mount my data export. So I can see my data export. And now let me mount my finance. So let me create a directory.
Do you have the routes configured? That's probably why it's not showing up.
Yeah, they should be in place. 2-1. Okay, so I've got my tenants. Let me mount my finance. So this guy's going to go to my other tenant IP. My export on the other tenant is called, actually, for the purpose of just demoing how it wouldn't be available. So here I'm trying to mount to my second tenant IP, but supplying the name of the export that's presented to my first tenant. And as we can see here, it's not quite as fast. It's going to sit here for a while and time out. So we'll cancel that. And I will correct that mistake. The export in my second tenant is actually called finance_export.
I don't think you have the default gateway set for your other thing.
You may be right.
Yeah, I'll fix it real quick. It'll take me a second.
Yep. Okay.
We'll do it live.
Okay, so while we look at that, so that's the flexibility that you have with multi-tenancy.
Now, Phil, can I do? I know we have management and data protocols there. Is there a way to push only? Can I make a tenant for only, say, replication, or a tenant for only, say, S3?
Yes, you can. Oh, sorry, not S3. S3 and FTP are not tenant aware. They're available on all tenants at all times. But replication is a protocol that is tenant aware. So if we look at our CLI multi-tenancy list tenants, if we take our finance tenant there and let's modify it. So we'll do this together here. So I'll do modify tenant and we'll run a -- help to see what options are available. So when we modify, we need to specify the ID of the tenant we're trying to modify, and then all the other fields are the changes we want to apply. So if I repeat that and do -- ID, and in this case, I have NFS and SMB enabled, what I want to do is I want to disable those. So disable -SMB, disable -NFS, and then I only want to enable replication. So that change takes, and if I look at my list tenants now, we can see that my finance tenant only has replication enabled. If I refresh my web UI, my NFS and SMB protocols are gone, and my replication is the only protocol that's available. So at this point, if I wanted to talk to this cluster over my finance tenant IP address, I wouldn't be able to do it other than replication from another Qumulo cluster, because that's the only network port that's currently listening and open, waiting for communication. And that actually brings up a good thing. So another cool little tidbit with network multi-tenancy is you can do something just like that to immediately block access to a cluster. So if we look at my file explorer here, so I was connected to my finance tenant, and technically I'm still seeing it, but this is only Windows caching what's there. I've already blocked access to this by removing the SMB protocol from that tenant. So if I try to create a new file, it's going to try and realize, oh, I can't. That port's not listening. So this is just Windows caching. If I hit my network name, same thing. The SMB protocol is completely off at the moment while I was connected into it. So all access to this is blocked. There is no way I can't open, I can't click in. This is just Windows showing me what was last cached on my browser, and it's gone. So another little.
You don't have NFS turned on the other tenant. That's why, Phil.
Oh yeah, I had disabled it just now.
Oh, you did? Okay, sorry.
Yeah. But that's another little cool thing you can do with that network multi-tenancy is you can immediately block access to the different protocols on any tenant. And dare I show this, but you can do the same for your existing default tenant. So let's say something happened in my environment and I want to immediately block SMB and NFS access to my default tenant. So I don't want anybody to have NFS or SMB access at all because I need to look into a massive issue in my environment. So I can disable SMB, disable -NFS. Help if I could spell disable. Now, I haven't disabled web UI, so I still have access over my default tenant. But as we can see, now there's no data protocols. So I have zero access. I come here and refresh, it's gone. Immediately have zero access to NFS and SMB protocols on my entire cluster effectively because neither of my tenants, nor my default or my newly added tenant, have the protocol exposed to them at the moment. And you could get crazy and disable all tenants, but you run the risk of locking yourself out from being able to modify it if you don't have IPMI access in order to get back to the CLI of the cluster. Like if I were to disable SSH, WebUI, REST, and replication from my default tenant, my cluster is effectively dark at that point, and I'd need IPMI or ILO access or console access with a keyboard and mouse in order to get to the CLI and re-enable them. So fair warning, be cautious when disabling protocols over CLI that you don't lock yourself out, but you do have the option to do so in case there's ever an event that occurs in the infrastructure and you need to lock the cluster out completely without touching anything else or preventing it from running. So it doesn't prevent it from talking to AD, from talking to your NTP, but prevents access from clients on all levels. Any questions or anything else anyone would like to go over on the live demo before we switch back over to the slides? We've got some time here. Re-enable these.
So some of the requirements for getting multi-tenancy to work is obviously you have to have multiple networks configured on your Qumulo cluster. And that it's going to be defined via tagged VLANs, as Phil can show you on the configuration there on the UI. So this is something that's one of the requirements. So before you can take advantage of network multi-tenancy, obviously you need to have multiple networks configured on your Qumulo cluster. And these features also will work with the other network restrictions that we have in place. So your export rules for NFS, they still continue to work. And your SMB network share restrictions will also work, meaning that you have, along with splitting your cluster into multiple presences on the network, you can then determine what access, extra access control you're going to have inside of those, the share points you have into your environment, meaning that if, you can say that you have access to the financial tenant, but you have to be coming from the building for you to have access to a particular SMB share. And that's a property of the SMB share itself. We can show you how that looks. So we got a question. Yeah. So is LDAP traffic going out by the default via the default network? That is correct. So the traffic goes out through the default network.
Yeah. So the cluster by default leverages the lowest numbered network ID to communicate out. So it's best practice to ensure that your cluster's default gateway is set on that ID so that we can communicate with your AD, LDAP, NTP, cloud-based monitoring, Nexus through that network ID.
So if you run a QQ network list interfaces, that's going to be the default path out for anything that's not covered specifically by multi-tenancy. So the different protocols that you see on the GUI right there. So all the other backend traffic goes out that way right there.
Any other questions? Okay. All right, so back to our slides. So some reading material for network multi-tenancy. We have our resources. So our main network multi-tenancy documentation is listed in our docs.qumulo.com administration guide under network multi-tenancy. Inside that main document, you'll see 3 sub-documents. So partitioning a cluster into tenants, and that covers creating a tenant as well as adding networks into that tenant. We then have the configuring management protocols on a tenant, and that covers modifying a tenant to enable or disable the quote-unquote management type protocols. And then the same for file system protocols and managing SMB and NFS access to a tenant, and also covers how to enable the NFS v4 within a tenant that has NFS as a whole enabled.
All right. And with that, we'll let you get back to your day out there. If you see any talking dogs, be sure to feed them tacos. Until next month, take care.